Hello, everyone. Got a few dirty jokes for you today.
So, a cowboy gets with a virgin. As she reaches her hand down his pants and grabs his manhood, she says, "What is that?" "Oh, that. Or that there is my rope," replied the cowboy. She goes a little further and grips his balls while saying, "What are these?" "Well, those there are my nuts," exclaimed the cowboy. The two start going at it, and the girl keeps yanking on the cowboy's nuts. "What in tarnation are you doing?" yells the cowboy. "I'm trying to loosen up these knots," replied the girl. "I need some more rope." So two cowboys are out riding the range and talking about their favorite lovemaking positions. The first cowboy says the rodeo position is his favorite. The second cowboy says he's never heard of it before and asks how to do it. The first cowboy responds, "Well, you mount your lady from behind, then reach down and grab her breasts. Then you whisper, 'These feel almost as good as your sister's.' Then you yell yeehaw and try to hold on for 8 seconds. So, a Baptist preacher sits next to a cowboy on a flight. After the plane takes off, the cowboy asks for whiskey and soda, which is promptly brought and placed before him. The flight attendant then asks the preacher if he would like a drink. Appalled, the preacher replies, "I'd rather be tied up and taken advantage of by women of ill repute than let liquor touch my lips." The cowboy then hands his drink back to the attendant and says, "Me too. I didn't know we had a choice." So a cowboy walked into a local insurance office, dusty boots and all, looking to buy himself a health insurance policy. The agent, a clean-cut fellow in a tie, welcomed him and began going through the standard list of questions. "Ever had an accident?" the agent asked, pen poised over the form. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, thought for a moment, and replied, "Nope, not one." The agent raised an eyebrow. "None. You've never had any accidents?" The cowboy shook his head firmly. "Nope. Haven't had one. Never." The agent flipped through the form, scanning the cowboy's earlier answers. "Well, it says here you were bitten by a snake once. Wouldn't you consider that an accident?" The cowboy sat up straight, narrowed his eyes, and said, "Heck no. That damn thing bit me on purpose." So a cowboy rides into town, ties his horse up outside the saloon, then casually walks behind the horse and plants a big old kiss right on its rear end. He strolls into the bar and orders a stiff drink. The bartender, having seen the whole thing, can't help but ask, "Hey, partner, why'd you kiss your horse on the ass? You got manure all over your lips." The cowboy downs his shot, wipes his mouth, and says, "Got chapped lips." The bartender frowns. "Wait, horse manure helps with chapped lips." The cowboy shrugs and says, "Nah, but it sure keeps me from licking them." So a cowboy, riding his trusty horse, stopped at an old tavern. He walked in and said, "Bartender, give me a drink, will you? One that's really strong." "Right away, sir," the bartender replied, pouring him a glass of strong, fine scotch. After drinking it quickly, the cowboy frowned and said, "What was that? If I wanted tap water, I would have asked for it." He reluctantly paid and left, grumbling, "I hope next time you give me something good." The next day, the cowboy returned on his horse, entered the tavern, and said more firmly, "Bartender, pour me a drink, and this time, make it really, really strong." "Of course, sir," the bartender said, now slightly annoyed. He mixed a cocktail using the strongest liquors he had saved over the years. But again, the cowboy shouted, "No, no, no. This is nowhere near strong. What kind of business are you running here, partner? It's a miracle you're still open." He stormed out without paying, still ranting about how he just wanted a real drink. The next day, the cowboy returned yet again. He walked in and said slowly, "Bartender, I want a drink. And this time, I want it really, really, really strong." "As you wish," the bartender said, having lost all patience. He went to the kitchen and mixed a glass with soap, hot sauce, rat poison, and a few other undisclosed ingredients. He served it without a word. The cowboy drank it all in one gulp, smiled and said, "Now, this is a strong drink. Nearly the best I've ever had. Thank you very much, bartender." He left a generous tip and walked out, joy beaming from his face. The next day, the cowboy returned calmly, approached the bar and said, "Bartender, I'd like a glass of tap water, please." The bartender looked at him and asked, "Really? Are you sure you don't want a really, 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 really strong drink, sir?" The cowboy replied, "Well, normally I would, but whatever you gave me yesterday made me able to kill my horse with a fart." So a Texan cowboy was walking down the road when a little old lady approached him. She asked, "Are you one of those cowboys everybody talks about?" "Why, yes, miss, I am," he replied. "The ones who ride around on horses and herd cattle." She continued, "Yes, miss, I am. The kind who ties up those calves and brands them?" She asked. "Yes, miss, I am." Obviously displeased, she scowled at him and said, "Well, you must be hung." The cowboy smiled and replied, "Yes, miss, I am." So an Arizona cowboy and a California cowboy are riding the fence line one day. They come across a sheep with its head stuck in the fence. The Arizona cowboy jumps off his horse, drops his jeans, and has his way with the sheep. When he gets finished, he looks at the California cowboy and asks, "You want to have a go?" The California cowboy says, "Hell, yeah," and jumps off his horse and jams his head in the fence. So, a 106-year-old cowboy in Texas passed away recently. On his last birthday, someone asked him the secret to his long life. He said, "Well, for the past 50 years, I've sprinkled a little gunpowder on my cereal every morning." He left behind 8 children, 21 grandchildren, 32 great-grandchildren, and a 15-foot hole in the crematorium. So a lone cowboy is riding across the plains when he spots a group of American Indians on the horizon, dozens of them, armed and charging his way. He gulps and thinks, "I'm screwed." But then, a calm voice in the back of his head says, "Not yet. Kill the chief." "What? Why?" The cowboy thinks. "Just trust me, kill the chief." The voice insists. The cowboy hesitates, but then draws his gun, takes aim, and shoots the chief right off his horse. For a moment, there's stunned silence. Then the voice in his head says, "Okay, now you're screwed." So for years, a cowboy named Hank worked his corner of the Old West frontier by himself. He'd sell his goods to people heading west and collected a good sum over time. Hank was notoriously tight-fisted with his money. He was getting on in age and, not having any kids, decided it was time to spend some of this money. He went into town, bought some supplies, and headed to the brothel. The headmistress, Miranda, met him at the door as he was looking at the girls and prices. "What'll you have, cowboy?" she says with a pucker of her lips. "It's been mighty long. I want a cheap girl that'll give to me rough." "Sure thing, sweetie pie. Head up to room 2. Shelley'll be in a few." He nods and heads up, taking out his whiskey and having a long draw. Sure enough, Shelley comes in and takes care of old cowboy Hank. He's having a grand old time, and boy, was she rough. After a while, he has her stop and says, "What do you say we go gentle for a spell?" She bites his lip and whispers, "I'll be back in a few minutes." She comes back and wow, what a difference. Hank is in heaven. She's even more amazing than before. Hank looks into her eyes. "Wow, honey. What did you do when you stepped out? This is amazing." As she's grinding him, she says, "I peeled off the scabs." So an old cowboy walks into a barber shop for a shave and a haircut. He settles into the chair and says, "I can never get a good shave. My cheeks are too wrinkled from age, you just can't get all the whiskers." The barber thinks for a moment, then grabs a small wooden ball from a cup on the shelf. "Here," he says, "put this inside your cheek. It'll stretch out the skin so I can get a cleaner shave." The old cowboy does as he's told, and sure enough, the barber gives him the smoothest shave he's had in years. When they're done, the cowboy smiles and says, "That's the best shave I've had in a long time. But what would have happened if I'd accidentally swallowed that little ball?" The barber shrugs and says, "Just bring it back in a couple days, like everyone else does." So a woman stops at a rural gas station so her little boy can use the bathroom. When he comes out, he spots his mom waiting in line at the register with a real cowboy standing behind her. The boy's eyes light up. He walks right up to the man and asks, "Excuse me, mister, are you a real cowboy?" The cowboy tips his hat and says, "Well, I sure am, son. See this hat? Keeps the sun off my face. This bandana keeps the dust from the herd out of my mouth. These chaps keep the brush from tearing up my legs." The boy looks down and frowns at the cowboy's shoes. The cowboy glances down too and says, "Ah, the tennis shoes. Those keep people from thinking I'm a truck driver from California." So, a cowboy strolls up to a farmer and asks if he's got any work. The farmer shakes his head and says, "Sorry, don't have any openings right now. Unless you've got some kind of special skill." The cowboy tips his hat and says, "Well, sir, I can talk to animals." The farmer snorts. "Yeah, I've heard that one before." Just then, a cow moose from behind the barn. With a grin, the farmer says, "All right then, what's she say?" The cowboy listens a moment and replies, "She says she's got feathers stuck to her udder and it's tickling her something awful." They walk over to check and sure enough, there are some feathers caught under her. The farmer pulls them out and the cow immediately settles down. Then, a horse in the pasture lets out a loud neigh. The farmer turns to the cowboy and says, "All right, what's his deal?" The cowboy says, "He says there's a nail sticking out of his back right hoof, and it's driving him crazy." They go look, and wouldn't you know it, there's a nail. The farmer pulls it out, amazed. Just then, a sheep in the barn lets out a panicked bleat. The farmer suddenly goes pale, throws up his hands and shouts, "All right, that's enough. It was just one time, and I was drunk as hell." So, A young cowboy strolls into a saloon and takes a seat at the counter. He notices an old cowboy sitting nearby, arms folded, staring down at a full bowl of chicken congee, just staring at it, not moving a muscle. After about 15 minutes of silence, the young cowboy finally speaks up. "If you ain't gonna eat that, mind if I do?" The old cowboy slowly turns his head and, in a slow drawl, says, "Nah, go ahead." Grinning, the young cowboy slides the bowl over and starts digging in like he hasn't eaten in days. He gets almost to the bottom, then suddenly freezes. There, in the congee, is a dead mouse. He gags, then violently throws up everything he just ate right back into the bowl. The old cowboy leans over, looks into the mess, and says calmly, "Yep, that's about as far as I got, too." So the U.S. Forest Service were presenting an alternative to Wyoming ranchers for controlling the coyote population. After years of the ranchers using the tried and true methods of shooting or trapping the predators, the naturalists had come up with a more humane solution. What they proposed was to capture the animals alive, castrate the males, and then release them back into the wild. The idea was that this would control the population without killing the coyotes. This was actually proposed to the Wyoming Wool and Sheep Growers Association by the Sierra Club and the Forest Service. All of the ranchers thought about this amazing idea for a couple of minutes. Finally, an old cowboy in the back stood up, tipped his hat back, and said, "Son, I don't think you understand the problem. Those coyotes ain't screwing our sheep. They're eating them." So a cowboy rides up to a saloon, ties up his horse, and strolls inside. He walks up to the bar and says, "20 bottles of whiskey. My horse is thirsty." The bartender raises an eyebrow, but shrugs and brings out the bottles. The cowboy pays, takes them outside, and lets his horse drink every last drop. The cowboy walks back in, and the bartender says, "Hey, ain't you gonna order something for yourself?" The cowboy tips his hat and says, "Are you crazy? I'm driving." So a cowboy is hitching his horse in front of the saloon when a man bursts out the doors, pistol drawn, and storms off down the street. The cowboy walks inside, passes a barfly nursing a half-empty drink, orders a beer, and asks, "Who's the guy who just stormed out looking for trouble?" The barfly tips his hat back and says, "Oh, him. That's Jake, the killer. Meanest gun in the West. There's a $100 bounty on his head. I'm the lawman here to pay it to whoever shoots him down." The cowboy's eyes light up. $100? Hold my beer. He slams the mug on the bar and runs out after Jake. Gunshots ring out. Moments later, the cowboy walks back in, smelling of gunpowder. He heads to the bar where the barfly is now sipping from the cowboy's beer. The cowboy says, "I shot him. Now hand over my $100 and my beer." The barfly looks him up and down and says calmly, "Sir, I don't know who you are or what you're talking about. But this here's my beer. And if you got a problem with that, we can settle it outside." After I finish my drink, the cowboy glares, storms out, pistol in hand, fury in his eyes. A moment later, another cowboy walks in, nods to the barfly, and orders a beer. He glances toward the door and asks,
"Who was that angry fella just now?"
The barfly takes a slow sip from his mug, sets it down, and says, "Oh, him? That's Jake, the killer." So a group of cowboys sat around a card table, arguing about who had the fastest draw. Finally, one rough-looking cowboy slammed his drink down and hollered, Ain't no man faster than me. They call me Grim, 'cause I take more lives than the Reaper. A voice from across the saloon called back. Well, I've been to both sides of the Mississippi and every other direction on the map. Ain't met a faster man than me. They call me Sixes, 'cause I can draw and fire off 6 rounds before most men can even get their gun out of their holster. After some hootin' and hollerin' and egging on by the patrons, the two decided to head outside to settle who was the fastest draw. Out in the dusty street, now lined on both sides with saloon patrons, they stood back to back, each taking 30 paces before turning to face each other. In a flash, before Grim even knew what had happened, Sixes drew his gun and unloaded all 6 rounds. Grim stood stunned, his hand still resting on his holstered gun. He hadn't been hit. Turning his head toward the commotion on the side of the street, Grim saw 6 men lying dead on the ground. He turned back to Sixes, who smirked. I said I was the fastest. I never said nothing about accuracy. So a lone cowboy nobody had ever seen before rides into a dusty mining town and walks into the saloon. He orders 2 drinks and sips them slowly at the bar. When he finishes, he tosses a few coins on the counter and heads back outside, only to find his horse, along with all his gear, gone. Without a word, he turns on his heel, strides back into the saloon, draws both his pistols, and fires them into the ceiling. The room goes dead silent. Whichever one of you cow-dung thieves took my horse better have it back by the time I finish my next drink, he growls. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to do what I did back in Texas. And trust me, I sure as hell don't want to do that again. He holsters his guns, sits back at the bar, and orders another drink, this time slower than before. The room is filled with whispers and nervous glances. No one says a word to him. When he finishes his drink, the cowboy stands up, walks outside, and sure enough, his horse is standing right where he left it. He climbs into the saddle just as the bartender and several patrons rush out behind him. "Mister," the bartender calls out, "we're real sorry about what happened. But please, you got to tell us what happened in Texas." The cowboy tips his hat, looks them dead in the eye, and says, "I had to walk home." So a cowboy walks into a bar and takes a seat next to a very attractive woman. He gives her a quick glance, then casually looks at his watch for a moment. The woman notices this and asks, "Is your date running late?" "No," he replies. "I just got this state-of-the-art watch, and I was just testing it." The intrigued woman says, "A state-of-the-art watch? What's so special about it?" The cowboy explains, "It uses alpha waves to talk to me telepathically." The lady says, "What's it telling you now?" "Well, it says you're not wearing any panties." The woman giggles and replies, "Well, it must be broken because I'm wearing panties." The cowboy smiles, taps his watch and says, "Damn thing's an hour fast." So a cowboy and an Indian are riding horseback across the plains. Suddenly, the Indian stops his horse, jumps off, and puts his ear to the ground. After a moment, he looks up at the cowboy and says, "Buffalo come." The cowboy looks around, sees nothing, then turns back and asks, "How the hell do you know that?" The Indian replies, "Ear sticky." So a cowboy walks into a bar and finds the place completely empty except for the bartender, quietly polishing a glass behind the counter. "Where is everybody?" the cowboy asks. The bartender glances up. "At the hanging." "Hanging?" the cowboy says, surprised. "Who are they stringing up?" "The brown paper kid." "The brown paper kid?" the cowboy repeats. "Ain't never heard of him." The bartender nods, wears brown paper pants, brown paper vest, even a brown paper hat. The cowboy squints. Well, I'll be damned. What did they get him for? The bartender puts down the glass and says, rustling. So two cowboys come upon an Indian lying on his stomach with his ear to the ground. One of the cowboys stops and says to the other, "What do you think he's doing?" The other replies, "Why, he's listening to the ground." Indians can hear things for miles in any direction by vibrations. Just then, the Indian looks up and says, "Covered wagon some 2 miles away. Have 2 horses, 1 brown, 1 white. Man, woman, child, household effects in wagon." The second cowboy shouts, "Why, that's incredible. This Indian knows how far away they are, how many horses, what color they are, who is in the wagon, and what's in the wagon. Damn amazing." The Indian looks up and says, "No, they ran over me about a half hour ago." So a Montana cowboy was overseeing his herd in a remote, mountainous pasture when suddenly a brand new BMW advanced out of a dust cloud toward him. The driver, a young man in a Brioni suit, Gucci shoes, Ray-Ban sunglasses, and YSL tie, leans out the window and asks the cowboy, "If I tell you exactly how many cows and calves you have in your herd, will you give me a calf?" The cowboy looks at the man, obviously a yuppie, then looks at his peacefully grazing herd and calmly answers, "Sure, why not?" The yuppie parks his car, whips out his Dell notebook computer, connects it to his iPhone cell phone, and surfs to a NASA page on the internet, where he calls up a GPS satellite navigation system to get an exact fix on his location, which he then feeds to another NASA satellite that scans the area in an ultra-high resolution photo. The young man then opens the digital photo in Adobe Photoshop and exports it to an image processing facility in Hamburg, Germany. Within seconds, he receives an email on his iPad that the image has been processed and the data stored. He then accesses a database through an ODBC-connected Excel spreadsheet with email on his BlackBerry, and, after a few minutes, receives a response. Finally, he prints out a full-color, 150-page report on his high-tech, miniaturized HP LaserJet printer, and finally turns to the cowboy and says, "You have exactly 1,586 cows and calves." "That's right." "Well, I guess you can take one of my calves," says the cowboy. He watches the young man select one of the animals and looks on amused as the young man stuffs it into the trunk of his car. Then the cowboy says to the young man, "Hey, if I can tell you exactly what your business is, will you give me back my calf?" The young man thinks about it for a second and then says, "Okay, why not?" "You're a congressman in the U.S. government," says the cowboy. "Wow, that's correct," says the yuppie. "But how did you guess that?" "No guessing required," answered the cowboy. "You showed up here, even though nobody called you. You want to get paid for an answer I already knew, to a question I never asked. You tried to show me how much smarter than me you are, and you don't know a thing about cows. This is a herd of sheep. Now give me back my dog." So, the sheriff of a small town steps out onto the street and sees a blonde cowboy walking down the sidewalk wearing nothing but his cowboy hat, boots, and a gun belt. Shocked, the sheriff immediately arrests him for indecent exposure. As he's locking him up, the sheriff asks, "Son, what in the world are you doing walking around like this?" The cowboy says, "Well, sheriff, it's like this. I was down at the bar when this pretty little redhead asked me to come back to her motorhome. So I went. Once we got inside, She pulled off her top and told me to take off my shirt, so I did. Then she took off her skirt and told me to take off my pants, so I did. Then she slipped off her panties and told me to take off my shorts, so I did. Then she climbed into bed, gave me a sultry look, and said, "Now, go to town, cowboy." So here I am. So one night a drunk cowboy rode into a small town. He immediately went to the only saloon in town and ordered a drink. While drinking, he asked the bartender if there was a room and any hot women around. The bartender told him he had a room for rent, and then glanced over to his friends drinking at another table. They decided to play a joke on the cowboy. As the evening drug on, the cowboy became very drunk but was still asking about a woman. Finally, the bartender sent his friends upstairs on a mission, and they returned shortly. Then the bartender told the cowboy that they only had one woman there, but she was upstairs waiting on him. The bartender's friends had carried a blow-up doll upstairs and placed her in his bed. At this point, the cowboy bid everyone good night and slowly climbed the stairs. Filled with anticipation, he approached the room and went inside as the men downstairs listened with great interest. After a few moments, they heard the bed springs squeaking and moans of pleasure coming from the room as they roared with laughter. Then everything was quiet. Not being able to sleep with anticipation of the coming morning, the men decided to play poker through the night and await the man coming down the next morning. As he came down the stairs, they noticed a strange look on his face. They asked, "Well, cowboy, how was the woman?" He hesitated, then answered, "Man, that was the best piece of ass I ever had, but the strangest thing happened. After I screwed her, I bit her on the breast and she farted and flew out the window, and I haven't seen her since." So a lady went into a bar in Texas and saw a cowboy with his feet propped up on a table. He had the biggest boots she'd ever seen. The woman asked the cowboy if it's true what they say about men with big feet are well endowed. The cowboy grinned and said, "Sure is, little lady. Why don't you come on out to the bunkhouse and let me prove it to you?" The woman wanted to find out for herself, so she spent the night with him. The next morning, she handed him a $100 bill. Blushing, he said, "Well, thanks, miss. I'm real flattered. Ain't nobody ever paid me for my services before." "Don't be flattered," said the woman. "Take the money and buy yourself some boots that fit." So one Sunday morning, an old cowboy entered a church just before the service was about to begin. Although the man and his clothes were spotlessly clean, he wore jeans, a denim shirt, and boots that were worn and ragged. In his hand, he carried a weathered hat and a well-used Bible. The church he entered was in a very upscale part of the city. It was the largest and most beautiful church the cowboy had ever seen. The congregation was dressed in expensive clothes and accessories. As the cowboy took a seat, others moved away from him. No one greeted him, spoke to him, or welcomed him. They were clearly appalled by his appearance and didn't bother to hide it. As he was leaving the church, the preacher approached him and said, "Before you come back here again, I'd like you to do me a favor. Have a talk with God and ask him what he thinks would be appropriate attire for worship." The old cowboy nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll do that." The next Sunday, the cowboy returned wearing the same jeans, shirt, boots, and hat. Once again, he was completely shunned and ignored. After the service, the preacher walked up to him and said, "I thought I asked you to speak to God before coming back to our church." "I did," the cowboy replied. "And what did God tell you was the proper attire for worship here?" the preacher asked. The old cowboy looked him in the eye and said, "Well, sir, God told me he didn't have a clue. He said he's never been in this church. So two cowboys walk into a bar and sit down for a drink. A woman sitting next to them, drinking her martini, starts choking on her olive. One cowboy says to the other cowboy, "I'm going to help that woman over there." He looks at her and says, "Are you choking?" And she nods, "Yes." "Do you want me to help you?" Again she nods, "Yes." With that, the cowboy lifts up her dress, pulls down her panties, and licks her bare butt. She gets so flustered, she spits out the olive, and he saves her life. As the cowboy sits down next to his friend, he says, "That hind lick maneuver works every time."